City
Meeting is being recorded.
89 days later.
Oh my.
And you know,
This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Rolette Reunion monthly seminar or education session. And today we really got a fine person, as if we haven't had fine persons in the past. But today we're with Mike Oiseth. Mike has specialized, you'd say, over the years. He'll tell you about himself on family history and his connection to Rolette County and his knowledge about others. And I must say this afternoon, as I look at the list of attendees, that we've got some of the best attendance we've had today. Kjell from Norway. Kjell, welcome. Aaron Kane, Mike Beaver, Inga Epping, Bernie Haraldson, Christina Epping, a couple people with telephones but no names, Frederica Gilgy, Randy Lee, Hi. Jeff Epping, Joyce Matthews, Joe Martinetti, Mike Oiseth. So this is a fine group. Mike, you can go to it.
all right. Well, the subject is Norwegian settlement of Rolette County. And I want to share with you some things that I've put together over the past 2-3 years of research. And it's going to be parts and pieces of that research because it's pretty hard to sum it all up inside 1 hour, but I'll do my best to try to cover what I prepared. The coverage is from 1885 to 1900, and those are my questions basically that I wanted to answer. As you can see, I'm not going to read everything that appears on the screen because a lot of people don't like that. Something about me. Well, I live in Bloomington, Minnesota. Both of my parents were from, ancestors were from Norway. I've been researching since the 1980s, and I have a special interest in the history of Norwegian settlements in the US and Canada. And I am related to Randy Lee, and I'm related to Garina Beaver, who is Randy's patriarch. She was the sister of my great-great-grandfather and moved to where my great-great-grandfather lived in Minnesota and then up to Becker County, Minnesota, and eventually in the 1880s to Rolette County. Her son, Andrew O. Beaver, was really one of the hardy survivors of early Rolette residents. He stayed with it and had a big family, and so you probably have heard plenty about many of his descendants. Here I am in the Salt Lake City Family History Library back in the 1980s. This is when I was really going at it real hard, traveling around, seeing a lot of places. And I happened to go through North Dakota and did research in courthouses, libraries, university libraries, and I stopped and saw the Beaver family in Rolette. It was a great adventure to meet all those people. They were very welcoming. I just think back to it so fondly because it was really a warm welcome that I got. Everybody helped out getting me to check everyone's family photo albums and share stories and have meals and so on. I really had a great time. That was in the 1980s, and then Randy and I discovered that both of us had been researching in Rolette. He's a little more closely related, descendant actually of Garina. Anyway, I am distantly related to Garina, and I am interested in the history of Rolette County. So we're going to start with an overview of the the whole immigration from Norway in the modern era. And we start with the ship restoration. This is a replica of that ship that sailed from Stavanger in 1825 and reached the port of New York City 89 days later. There were 52 passengers on that original ship, and one was born on the boat. It was a small boat, and when they tried to land in New York, the authorities told them, we can't let you do that. You're not legal because you have too many people aboard a boat that's too small. It was later that I think John Quincy Adams intervened and said, no, we're going to let these people come on land. So they got their start and they went to Kendall in Orleans County, New York, upstate New York. Here is the timeline on settlement in the United States by Norwegians up to the time that North Dakota was settled. We have the boat leaving Stavanger in 1825. In 1830s, most of the New York group had moved to Fox River settlement in Illinois. Then Wisconsin settlement started. Much of the settlement of Wisconsin continued on into the 1840s. And then by the 50s, we had Iowa and southern Minnesota taking in immigrants. And in the 1860s, the settlement of Minnesota expanded, and so it did in southeast Dakota territory, really South Dakota, we would call it today. And then in 1870s was the very beginnings of the northern Dakota territory settlement. As that continued on, we had another boom beyond the 1880s after 1900 in western North Dakota. There were a lot of immigrants that went and worked on Montana railroads, and they stayed there. From 1880 to 1900, many went to Canada's western provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And after the 1890s, most immigrants from Norway were focused on the Pacific Northwest because that's where most land was available and more opportunities for work, etc. Quite a number of them were involved in fishing and ocean and lake transportation and so forth. In the 1920s, finally, federal quotas kind of ended the big push of immigration by Norwegians into the United States. We also had this going on. Urban centers of Norwegian settlement, Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, Seattle, to mushroom. When the land was gone, there were still some city slickers, people that had trade jobs and were sailors working out of Chicago. They were working out of New York. Brooklyn was a center of Norwegian seamen who had settled there and were still active in the in shipping and passenger ship work. Well, in 1910, our U.S. Census and censuses of Canada here gave this data about where Norwegians were living in the U.S. and Canada. We see that they were very concentrated still in Illinois. Here's Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, western Wisconsin, Minnesota, top of Iowa, northeast Iowa, South Dakota, and then North Dakota up here. But all of these little numbered counties show the number of people from Norway who had settled there. So by 1910, every state had Norwegians, but in most localities, very few, except this concentrated area. And then you see New York, where the Brooklyn settlement was, and over here, Washington State, especially Seattle area and the Puget Sound. Norley also made this map, which shows the progression of settlement in the direction of the Northwest, moving at the rate of about 100 miles every decade. So he starts here with the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And you can see we're moving from, here's Lake Michigan and Chicago area right down in here. Here's southern Wisconsin. Then we get over here to Iowa and Minnesota and so on. By the 1870s, the beginnings of North Dakota settlement was happening, and we got quite a bit of further development settlement in North Dakota from the 1880s to 1890s. Here's a little closer look at that same map. And then we have the map of Martin Oiseth, who tried to represent where Norwegians were living in the U.S. This map has been criticized as exaggerating the presence of the Norwegians in the U.S. because the red areas were not exclusively Norwegian, as we know, but that is where they were heaviest, and over here and around Washington, Puget Sound, and so on. But you can see where there was a definite pattern of dispersion and concentration of Norwegian immigrants in certain parts of the country. They didn't throw darts at a map of the U.S. and just say, "Hey, let's go down to Tennessee and see what's going on down there," or New Mexico. Let's go explore what's in New Mexico. Now, some had to be adventurous enough to actually do that, but most stuck to areas where their fellow countrymen had already gone and established settlement areas. And because most people wanted to come and live among people who knew their language, and that might even be from the same place in Norway where they were coming from. They wanted to have something in common with those people. They wanted to be near relatives. They wanted to be near helpful people that would be welcoming. And we hear stories again and again of immigrants coming to the country and ending up in a little log house with 3 families living in it temporarily because that was the shelter that was available, but it was the goodwill of their fellow Norwegians that were providing that. Now we're going to move into North Dakota, Northern Dakota territory. Here are some of the main factors that various authorities have learned about that were prime factors in the settlement. The Homestead Act. Everybody wanted land, or the majority of Norwegian immigrants, who were farmers after all, they thought it was wonderful that the U.S. was offering this plan by which they could have virtually land for free if they would come and live on it and settle there for 5 years, develop it a little bit, and then it would be theirs without having to pay cash per acre.
Mike, I just wanted to mention to you that we've finished 15 minutes, and I'm sure you're planning the whole hour here, but just to keep in mind that the 25% of the way. So plan that accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I need to be aware of that. Thank you. So here are other factors, as you can read, and we're going to be looking at some of those as we move forward here. The Homestead Act of 1862 replaced the Preemption Act of 1841. So there had been on the books a way which allowed pre-1862 immigrants to come and gain land, but they had to pay cash for it. They had to pay $1.25 per acre, which sounds like a huge bargain today, but imagine what that was probably the equivalent of back in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and so on. There were some requirements. They had to build a home, farm the land for 5 years. They had to be heads of households or over 21 years. And I've kind of wondered about how they actually police that requirement, this age requirement, because many Norwegians came from Norway without any birth certificate or proof of age. So I think that they could get away with claiming, maybe a 17-year-old could claim that he was 21 and have access to land under the Homestead Act, but more power to him, I guess we would say. You had to have 2 witnesses after your 5-year period to testify that you had fulfilled your residency and so on. There were amendments in 1874, and these came to impact the people in Rolette County, I know, because a number of sources would indicate that in the 1880s, Rolette residents were acquiring land by use of the original Homestead Act of 1862, but also the Timber Culture Act, which allowed another 40 acres if trees were planted and fostered for 10 years. And then in more barren, less grassy areas, ownership of 640 acres was allowed in arid and semi-arid areas if irrigated for 3 years. And some residents of Rolette availed themselves of this provision by this date or in the 1880s. So this had a huge effect on the rate of immigration and westward expansion. Here are the land offices that opened up in North Dakota as people went west and had to file for claims. They went to these particular locations. One thing you'll notice here is that most of these, at least the top 4 or 3 of the 4, are on the eastern edge of North Dakota, whereas Bismarck is pretty much smack dab in the middle. And that was still only 1873 when that land office was set up. The reason for that is that the railroad went right through the midsection of the state or the territory at that time, northern part of the territory, and established a station in Bismarck. And so people began to rush into that area, follow the railroad, ride the railroad to that part of the territory. And this really impacted the fact that the railroad did that really impacted the pattern overall of where people moved and began to settle in across the state as time went on. Okay. We have a few other factors that need to get talked about a little bit. One would be, let's see, the rate of immigration. The early 1880s is the era that we're talking about, with Rolette County getting its first Norwegian settlers. And here we are at 1880. This line right here and the next couple are at some of the peak times in overall rate of immigration, as you can see. So this was an era where there were a lot of people entering the United States who were looking to find land, and the place to go was North Dakota. So those things coincided and became quite a factor. Seems like I'm repeating some things here in my set of slides. Railroad building then was a huge factor. And this was so important. The railroads themselves, some of them at least, were granted land that they were provided as a means of financing all the labor and the costs of laying track across the territory. If they had that land, they were allowed to own it and sell it to settlers every other alternate sections of land along the track, and make a profit from that they would use to pay their bills for doing all the expansion, the building. That was not true for all railroads. They didn't all get that provision.
Keep her going, Mike.
It was very important that the railroads provided, of course, ways to allow farmers to get their produce to markets, and also materials that didn't exist in many parts of Dakota, like materials for buildings and fences, wood, timber, heavy articles that cost so much after being hauled long distances. Those things, the obstacles there were sort of overcome with the railroad coming in play. Harold Briggs, one of the historians about early North Dakota, made the statement that the greatest, well, he quotes someone else, the greatest factor in the upbuilding of Dakota next to her vast expanse of public lands has been the railroad. Gradually, the fine agricultural lands, immense stock ranges would no doubt have been occupied, but without the railroad, it would have required a century to accomplish what has been done in 5 years under its powerful influence.
Mike, I'm sure you want to concentrate on Rolette County and maybe even have some questions. So I hope you keep moving well.
Okay. Well, here's a map of railroad development in 1886, and it shows Rolette County right here. So you can see how close did the railroad come into Rolette by 1886. There was a railroad here up to Rugby and to Bottineau. So some people coming in on the railroads, and some actually hired freight cars elsewhere, farther east, even in Minnesota, and shipped their goods, their household goods, aboard train cars up to these locations. And then they were able to haul them from those into Rolette, someplace where they had claimed land. All right, here's an important person, Paul Hjelm Hansen. He is said to have had tremendous influence on publicizing the opportunities in the Red River area and into the eastern edge of Dakota Territory. These are some of the Norwegian language newspapers that he published his articles in. You can see here's one newspaper, the Nordisk Folkeblad in Minneapolis, published his reports in 13 issues. There were a lot of people reading these newspapers who had come from Norway, who learned about the area of the Red River, and they were very enthusiastic about getting on up there and checking that out as a possible place to move to where more land would be available to them. One of the things that happened was the families, after a number of years of living in settlements in the US, the families had grown up. The kids were married and they needed farmland. And so a decision was made, oftentimes by an entire family group, extended family group, to go elsewhere in the nation in order to be in a location where land was available and they could all resume living near one another rather than splitting up and scattering over the country. The weather has been a big factor in the development of early northern Dakota territory. Here are some statements and facts taken out of the WPA biographies, which I'll say more about in a little bit. 1886, Torger Bakken broke some land and planted wheat. He raised a crop of 400 bushels that year. But in 1886, 87, 88, and 89, there were weather-related setbacks. And finally, that broke up a little bit and he got some luck. The Bernd Haagensen family lived on their claim in 88 and they broke up 5 acres and not a thing grew. Next year, seeded 20 acres into wheat, oats, and potatoes. It was too dry for even potatoes to grow. In 1900, they got a break. Olga Ugsted says that the summers of 89 and 1900 were very dry and crops were poor. John Shipstead, when he came to Rolette, his neighbors told him he could not raise corn due to frosts. And he reported that in 87, a heavy frost came on August 15th, froze everything. There was always danger of frost until late spring. So weather factors probably slowed the move of immigrants from Norway into Rolette County due to some of the weather conditions. And it wasn't isolated just in Rolette County. This was experienced in a lot of eastern North Dakota at that time. But you had to be a hardy soul to withstand bad crops for 4 or 5, maybe consecutive years, and still have the will to stay and succeed in farming.
Mike, you're providing wonderful information. It's been a half an hour now, and so I want you to make sure you have enough time to talk about the people coming into Rolette County. So keep it going.
I'll keep it going. Thank you. Okay, the communication networks were very important. John Hudson, who was one of the presenters earlier, Paul, in your series here of Zoom sessions, John Hudson, a geographer, professor at Northwestern University, wrote a fair amount about the communication networks that influenced where people settled. Included in that would be the America letters, immigrants back to family and friends in Norway. Also, the going the other direction, Norway letters from Norway to the US, and the publishing of some letters in newspapers of Norway and in Norwegian language papers in America, and even in English language newspapers in the US. Here's an example of a Otter Tail County, Fergus Falls, Minnesota Norwegian language newspaper that was published in 1887, among other years. And there were immigrants who avidly read these. They subscribed to them. The post office delivered their newspaper or had it available at the post office where they had to go to pick up their mail. States and shipping companies promoted immigration and settlement. That was part of the network. There were, of course, relatives, neighbors, and friends in Norwegian settlements that exchanged information. One of the things that Carlton Qualley, one of the Norwegian historians or historians of Norwegian settlement, has written about is how churches were gathering places. And it was very typical to see on a Sunday morning people arriving early in order to stand outside the church and chat about all kinds of latest news, including, did anybody get a letter from Norway recently? What's going on? And they would share that kind of information. They also probably did a little scheming about any intentions that they might have to move elsewhere out of that community and move on farther west or north. Visits home to Norway by those who had lived in the US or Canada had great impact, reportedly. When someone actually went home to their home neighborhood and talked about America, people were just fascinated with that, and it usually resulted in more moving from that same area over to the US. And then we know that many Norwegians were sent cash, prepaid tickets, or offers of employment, and that contributed directly. I wanted to show an example of someone that I happen to know about because he ended up in Dodge County, a place I've researched previously. Nils Gilderhus came from Voss, Hordaland, in 1839, very early. He settled in the Fox River settlement below Chicago, quite a ways below Chicago. And in 1840, he made a trip. He walked up to Dane County, Wisconsin, and checked out the land that was available there. He is one of the very first Norwegian residents of Koshkanon, a very famous settlement area where many, many came from Norway before they went elsewhere in the US. From there, in the 1850s, Gilderhus moved to Dodge County, Minnesota. He lived there until 1881, and again he moved up to North Dakota. So he
Keep it going. You got to move it.
Go ahead.
You got to move quicker.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll skip over that. I guess I kind of summarized it. Another concept here is the big component. Some settlements in the US were composed mostly of immigrants from a particular place in Norway. They did, birds flocked together, birds of a feather flocked together. But with the Norwegians, it wasn't just that I want to go where Norwegians are. It was, I want to go where people who, like me, came from a particular part of Norway. I want to find those people. That's the group that I really want to try to live with and locate with, because we'll have a lot in common. So Laval, in his book, Folk Epic, The Big Log in America, said that, natives from southwestern Norway settled especially in Illinois, in the Fox River area, and in Benton and Story counties in Iowa. Lee County, Illinois, became the home of many persons from Hardanger. The Vossings grew numerous in the city of Chicago. Eastern Koshkonong and Jefferson Prairie in southern Wisconsin received many from Numedal in Buskerud, Norway. People from Telemark made up a big element in Koshkonong as well. And in Muskego, at the Muskego settlement in Racine County, Manitowoc became a stronghold of Valdres folks, and so forth. So we can see that people from a particular neighborhood in Norway were inclined to go where others that they knew about. And the way they knew about them is from the communication networks that we talked about earlier. They had seen the letters had been shared, some had been published in newspapers. People were quite well aware of where others from their own hometown had been living in the US. It made them want to go to those same places. Here are some other point-to-point, I call them migrations, groups that moved from one place settlement in the US to another. Rock County, Wisconsin to St. Ansgar, Mitchell County, Iowa. And all of these, there was a Northwood, Iowa group that went and created Northwood in Grand Forks County. In Dodge County, Minnesota, from Westfield and Blooming Prairie, Steele County, Dodge County, a group went in 1877 to Grand Forks County.
Do you have some specific information on Rolette County that you have not shared yet?
Yes.
Okay, well, if you can get to that, I think that's going to be very helpful.
Okay, I'll just quickly show this map that indicates that there were these many point-to-point moves by groups of people living in one settlement and going to another. And these have all been identified. If you look over here, for instance, number 14, that's St. Ansgar, Mitchell County. Over here, Alameda and Winneshiek counties, and then on up into Minnesota. There were patterns that were repeated again and again. We have a group here going from the settlement south of Chicago down to Missouri, and then up into this southeastern corner of Iowa. All right, in North Dakota, here's my map I made showing what is known about the earliest Norwegian settlements in each of the counties. And you'll notice that it started, of course, over here on the eastern edge, 1860s, 1870s. Pembina was one of the very earliest.
We can see that, Mike, that it gradually improved. Yeah, we can see that.
And in this one, you'll notice is kind of unusual. Burleigh County, there was a date of 1878. The first Norwegians were there. How come they jumped over all these other areas and ended up here in 1878? The railroad went east, or from the east went west into Burleigh County. And at Bismarck established a station in 1873. Okay, here are the earliest Norwegian residents that I've learned about. 1882, 3 brothers from Stavanger settled near Dunseith. And there's one of them. Christian Cleveland came from originally Milwaukee, where he'd previously come from Norway to Milwaukee. He had a sailing background, and so he worked at Cleveland or at Milwaukee for a while on ships. Here's 1883, some of the very early ones. Knut Hammet, Peter Swingen from Gudbrandsdalen. And it proved that later that Gudbrandsdalen Uppland was one of the heavy contributors to Rolette County from the very beginning. Some of the other things that have been noted about early arrivals in Rolette County are on the screen here. I'll let you kind of glance at what you want. We have the Ox Creek Church that was organized in 1884. And among those early officers, T.O. Stagaberg, who had been at Goodhue County, southern Minnesota, J.M. Ingebretson, Lars Broughton, Carl Hansen, E.P. Bratley, John Thorson, Ole Otbrat. Still today, we know many burials are in North Creek Cemetery and in South Creek. We have the Willow Creek Church at Overley, which is right on the border between Bottineau County and Rolette. 1885, it was organized, and here are some big names that continued on. Hagen, Ahmet, Cleveland again, Oiseth, Svingen. I happened to stumble across this fact that in 1871, a ship called the Nordensdrunning sailed from Stavanger to Quebec. And aboard that ship happened to be these three families who were among 408 passengers overall on that ship. But all three of these families eventually ended up in Rolette County. Now that's kind of a rare thing that you don't stumble upon every time you do some research. It's quite remarkable. They all came from areas, Rogaland and from Aust-Agder. In the 85 county territorial census, here's what I found. Let's see, there was still some strength there. 13 from Uppland. The Buskerud family group consisted in large part of Beaver family members. And then quite a bit of diversity, really. People coming from quite a number of areas in different places in Norway. Among the Norwegian American residents, you can see the distribution here in their backgrounds. They came from Wisconsin, Minnesota.
There's Garina Beaver. She's buried at Westland Cemetery.
Yes. And you see only 5 who were in that 1885 territorial census remained and died in Rolette County. That's a small number. So there was a lot of turnover, a lot of out-migration.
Still there today.
Here's burial places.
15 minutes, Mike, before the top of the hour.
Thank you. Couple of interesting cases I found. Kari Button. She had lived in Walnut Grove, Redwood County, Minnesota. And if you're a fan of Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie stories, that is where Laura Ingalls' family had lived at the same time that Kari lived. And at least one tree on Ancestry says that the character Nellie in the Little House on the Prairie TV series is modeled after this same Kari. I just thought it was kind of an interesting little fact to know. Here is another instance of someone that we know here, Knut Olsen Amat, was in 1880, before coming to Rolette, a resident of Walnut Grove, Redwood County also. And a little bit remarkable, I think, too, in the fact that in 1875, there were fewer than 300 Norwegians living in all of Redwood County, Minnesota. It wasn't a very densely populated area for Norwegians. Another interesting case that I came across by way of Laura Law's book about Rolette County, the Franklin expedition of 1845 left a lot of mysteries about what happened to that expedition, the people involved with it. Franklin was a commander in the British Navy. He was exploring a possible route from Europe to Asia over the top of Canada through the Arctic Ocean. And he had 2 ships in his expedition with 129 men total. This is just part of a page in Google Images that is about the Franklin expedition. It goes on and on and on. And there are many books that have been written, films that have been made, and research. I just watched this past week something called Lost in the Arctic, about a group of Americans and a Canadian man who went over some of the same area up in Canada where this expedition was stranded in the ice. Well, Peter Tollefson was an early resident of Rolette in both the 1885 and 1900 censuses. He was born in Norway in 1834. He was in the army, and supposedly, according to the story that he told later, much later in his life, was that he took part in a mission, including some Norwegians, to recover the survivors of the Franklin expedition, if there were any, or to learn about how they might have died, what their circumstances were when they were lost.
That's fascinating that we had a Norwegian from Rolette County. Very good.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the
10
ship
minutes.
with
10
the
minutes.
ship with the ship with Tollefson's group also became trapped in ice. According to his count, he and 2 others were able to save themselves by traveling down the Mackenzie River in Canada, and managed to get eventually then even further into settlements on the Red River near Winnipeg. He met William Darling, who later was a Dunseith, Rolette County resident, and Darling convinced him to come to Rolette County. So that's quite interesting. We have some facts about Peter Tollefson, that he was in fact married by the 1870 census of Manitoba. He married an English Métis woman, Isabel Thompson, had 4 children, daughters born in Canada. Some of them came to Rolette with him and were in the or were either with their father or with the husband in Rolette County. We have the big caravan in 1887 and 88 from Otter Tail, Pelican Rapids, Otter Tail County. These photos are not actually people that we know who came and lived in Rolette, but they're representative maybe of some who did that kind of thing. Here's the route. Otter Tail is over here. Pelican Rapids is about at this point. They moved in this direction up through Grand Forks and over to Rolette. The distance is about 290 miles. The travel time was about, according to those who were in the caravan, they made progress at about 15 miles a day. It took one group 3 weeks. Another group required 18 days to get from Otter Tail to Rolette. Now, some of them have been up there scouting for land. So they already had land to go to when they arrived. Some things about Otter Tail. Why would Otter Tail lose that much of their population to Rolette County? Here's an interesting fact, I think. 1890, we have the census summaries for that. We don't have the actual, household schedules that show who was living where, but we know numbers, and someone has done the work of looking at where most Norwegians were living in 1890. Cook County, Illinois, where Chicago is, not a surprise. Hennepin County, Minnesota, not too much of a surprise. Polk, Minnesota, something of a surprise, way up north, opposite what? Grand Forks County, across the river. And Dane, Wisconsin, where at Koshkonong so many Norwegians poured in over decades. But Otter Tail jumped up very quickly to be number 5. So it was a crowded place, and people needed land. They wanted land for their children, and they decided to make the move. Here are some of the people.
You got to tell us what's most important to you in the next 5 minutes.
Okay,
well, left, what you really want to get across in 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll just show that I have made a chart of people from the caravan and the places they came from in Norway, where they lived in Rolette once they got there, and so on. There's quite a few from Ringsaker, Hedmark were in that couple years of caravans. Here is John Selvig. He was a member of the caravan, one of the caravans. I figured out that here's where most of the caravan people came from. One was actually from Fillmore County, not Norway, but he was Norwegian in background. There were 21 heads of households. There were 15 spouses. There were at least 55, or there could have been as many as 55 children. Children born before the caravan years. So if all of those traveled with their parents, it's possible that 91 residents of Rolette came in the years 87 and 88 to Rolette County. Here's another family that came, the Bernd Hagensen family. There's a lot of detail in here, stories told in the WPA bios about their experiences in moving from Otter Tail to Rolette. John Hudson created a couple very interesting maps, I think. Here are Norwegian Americans, people that had already been established in the US living there. And as they moved up to North Dakota, here are the routes, the places of origin, and where they went. You can see some of the heavy areas were western Wisconsin, northeast Iowa, southeast Minnesota, and on up. Many came right up to the Red River area. Others went farther probably on railroads. And then there were some latecomers who ended up over here in the late 1880s or 1890s, even in the western part of the state. Now, the Norwegian born, he says in his map, came from Quebec, which would be this bunch here, who filtered on over into various places. This would include Rolette people probably, and then along the eastern part of the state and through New York port and Baltimore and Boston. They came quite directly, but some stopped along the way in the southeastern part of Minnesota and northeast Iowa in particular.
Do you have one
I
final
found-
point to make about Rolette County?
Paul, I think this is interesting. We can go a few more minutes longer.
All
I'll
right.
make the-
Jeff says we can go a little further.
I'll
Okay,
try to keep it
going.
moving here.
Jeff, you make that decision, Jeff.
Look, yeah, well, I'm this stuff's interesting. I'll give 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to keep moving. Land claims in Rolette County. This is based on records of the Bureau of Land Management. And I found 109 Norwegian individuals made land claims before 1900. That's an estimate. My estimate, the reason I have to call it an estimate is there's nothing in these BLM land records that tell you what the nationalities of these people were. I had to base it all on their names and then do follow-up by looking them up in other sources and learning whether or not they were Norwegians or not. There are a few I see listed right here, for instance, August Rosberg, he was a Swede. Sounded a little bit like he could have been a Norwegian, but not so. Anyway, 109 approximately made land claims between the 1880s and 1900. Only 37 of these were present in the 1900 census of Rolette. That seems like quite an attrition rate. They left. They did not stay. Here was my source for the land claims, the land patents. Here's a page of returns from that website. When I put in the name Beaver in Rolette County, here's the listing of the land patentees. We have a couple people missing though from the Beaver group because Garina Beaver's sister, Christina, and her husband and her brother-in-law were also land claim, land patent owners. You can go to this website, it's free, and look up names from your family and see what you find. It can be quite fascinating. Another place to get information about the land records or ownership is in the Bureau of Land Management tract books. A whole bunch of volunteers worked on this for the website familysearch.org. And here you can search for a name, you can put in the place that you're concerned with, Rolette County, something like that, even a birth date or death year about that person. And you'll get a link to something that looks about like this, where you see in the old land office ledgers that were kept at the time, these are all from Devil's Lake. You'll see Enoch T. Gilgy is here, Garina Beaver is here, Andrew O. Beaver, that's Garina's son. Some others, Kittle, Knutson, Juve, Charles Martin. That is a Beaver family in-law. And so it's quite interesting. What it tells you here is when the claim was actually made. Based on this, it looked like Garina may have made a claim as early as, well, may have received ownership in 1887. And it took about 5 years to process. So she might have been there as early as 1882 to claim some land. That needs to be researched further, I think. Here's a little closer look at the same part of the same page. We learned from the tract book whether the deal went through or whether the person commuted the claim, that is paid cash early, or may have relinquished it altogether, just gave up on it. We got to get back to, okay, the 1900 census. Here were people in the 1900 census, about 511 I found. So under half of those were actually born in Norway. Many maybe had come from somewhere else in North Dakota, because this is possibly their children were born in places in North Dakota, although some of the residents, adult residents, may have been born in North Dakota also. 80 from Minnesota, not surprising. 26 from Wisconsin. We had 9 from Sweden, but those were people I considered to be included because they were married to Norwegians. There were 6 that were born in Canada. I think that includes the Peter Tollefson family with his daughters. Now, this tells you where in the 1900 federal census residents of Rolette, who were Norwegians, had come from in Norway. And you'll see the top 2 by quite a bit were Uppland and Rogaland. And I kind of wonder whether that pattern has persisted into even the present. The people that stayed overall the longest in number were greatest from these 2 parts of Norway, Uppland and Rogaland. Then from death places of those who were in the Rolette County census, you can see something about dispersal. Where did they go? If they didn't stay in Rolette, where in the world did they end up? Well, look at that. 29 died in Canada. 27 had gone back to someplace in Minnesota. 18 were in Bottineau, but that's close by, and some of them may even have been living in Rolette for some time before they happened to die in Bottineau next door. And the pattern here, California, Washington, Oregon, these West Coast states, that's very typical of people moving out of the Norwegian areas of the Midwest, upper Midwest. These are the same kinds of destinations they went, almost the same proportions that I've seen again and again. Montana, some went back to Wisconsin, but they went to the far west too. 3 went back to Norway. Here's a listing of marriages of those who had come from Norway in the 1900 federal census of Rolette. These are people we know happened to get married. Well, I wanted to show this picture of a sod house over in Bottineau County. It's the only color picture I know of a sod house. Here's a log house that was built in Cass County, North Dakota, but it was thought to be a very typical model of a house owned by a Norwegian immigrant in North Dakota. And people in Norway came, discovered it, took a look at it, decided it was of the quality they were looking for to transport back to Norway. And it is now today, and this picture was taken in Norway, it is a house that is in an outdoor museum in Norway. The owner of that house was Peter Borderud from Gru, Hedmark. And by the way, his granddaughter, great granddaughter, is my house cleaner in Bloomington. So that's one way I know about that one. I want to show one last map here. Here's Rolette County according to William Sherman. In his book, here's Sherman's book, Prairie Mosaic. And in that book, there is this map. I've colorized it with the blue just to show off a little bit more obviously where the Norwegians were within the boundaries of Rolette County. And you can see they're in a group of separate areas, most down in here, southern part. And of course, over here, the western part bordering on Bottineau County. Well, I don't know if there's time for any questions or not, but I'd be glad
What era is that map?
Very good question. I knew somebody would ask that, and I didn't have the answer handy either. This is William Sherman's work, and his book was published in 1983 originally, so it might have been there at that time. And the book was, a second edition came out in 2017, but I think the map work had probably already been done for the first edition.
I have a copy of that book. I have a copy of that map.
He went through the entire state of North Dakota and did this kind of thing. He divided the state up into 9 sections and went through each county, determining where people of these various ethnicities lived within each county. That's a lot of tiresome work.
Well, I know we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to say how much I appreciate all the work, Michael, you put into this. And I found that your comments on the towards the beginning of where these people were settling and those timelines of where they were moving and stuff, really interesting. So
Good.
thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
I have one question, Mike.
Okay.
The arable land in Norway is 3%. It's tiny.
Yeah.
So the implication is there aren't many farmers. I looked at the statistic population in Norway over time while you're making your presentation, and it flattens in 1880. So that average of 20 to 30,000 a year did have an impact on Norwegian population growth. But the idea that they obviously all came to farming land, but the pool wasn't that great. Do you have any thoughts on that? Did essentially all the farmers come over?
Did all the farmers from Norway?
Well, the population of Norway in 1880 was not 1.95 million, and a significant number of people came over to the U.S. for farming. And there weren't that many farmers, there still aren't that many farmers in Norway. Have you research or have any thoughts about, were there others in the population that came over, or were there other attractions besides farming that
There
that
were
brought
other
people to the US?
attractions, I mean, well, another factor is that there were return migrants. Rod Laval has said that fairly recently, I read a statement from him. He said that as many as 1/4 to 1/3 of immigrants from Norway returned to live in Norway.
Yeah.
But that doesn't account for what you're talking about entirely. There were people in other occupations than agriculture. There were people in the trades. There were people that went to the cities to work. There were fishermen. There were sailors, and people working on ships in the Great Lakes in off the west coast of the U.S. and out of New York. Go ahead. So there were, we tend to focus on farming, and I think it was about 80% of immigrants, or at least 70 to 80% of immigrants from Norway were interested in farming when they came to the U.S. It's what they did in Norway. There wasn't a lot of diversity of occupations for many years.
Mhm.
As industrialization came to Norway, and also as things started to change in the cities, more and more employment was found in Norwegian cities too. They moved from the countryside into some of the urban centers of Norway. I don't know. I'd be interested in knowing others' comments about that, or
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I think that there might be a population boom in Norway at the same time, and the farms were rather small. So like if you have 5, 10 children in a family, and there was not so much industry in Norway, I think. So for many, it was a good way to start a new life in America. And in Norway, the farms were rather small, and they couldn't divide the farms. And at the same time, but at the same time, later on, the Norwegian government they said that you can divide the farms up in smaller bits, because the Norwegian governments, they weren't too happy about all these people moving to America.
I can't imagine they were.
Yeah, because America was draining the country for adults who should be in Norway, not in America. So and at the same time, I think the agriculture in Norway, the methods, they got better, so they could in fact divide the farms more than before. So these things happen at the same time, maybe.
I have heard that returning farmers to Norway who had lived in the U.S. and farmed for a while brought methods from the U.S. back there, and those impacted the farming in Norway, and that they had added to some success in the country.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the population boom too that occurred, and I think that was one of the beginnings of that was one of the factors that people have cited as to why Norwegians left, because things were starting to get quite crowded, and the farms were too small to support all the people that were coming up.
Okay. Well, thanks. Mike, can you make your presentation available, or is that possible?
Is this recorded?
Yeah, yes, it is.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But I can
But I think,
make
Mike,
I
on
can-
that point, if you could send me the actual PowerPoint, we can send that out, and that will be complete, that people can take their time going through it. So if you could do that to me, I appreciate.
well, I'm wondering if I should make it into a PDF file.
Yeah, we can do that.
That would
In fact,
that would make
we'll
it smaller.
Make it into a PDF first. That'll be good.
More
Yeah.
portable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I
Very
did want to leave this on the screen for quite a while because if anybody has any further thoughts or questions or whatever, anything about sources, I had intended to attach a lengthy bibliography, recommended places to go to get more related information, some of my favorites and so on. And I just didn't get around to getting that part done. So that's maybe something I will do in the future too.
Thank you, Mike. It was outstanding.
Thank you. I appreciate your patience. Thanks a lot. And Jeff, thanks for your relinquishing some time.
Oh, that's okay.
I didn't know
Well,
how long
we'll
this
get
thing
through our
was going
meeting.
to run today. So
Okay.
Thank you.
thank
Mike.
you. Good to see y'all.
Thank
All
you.
right. Okay. Now we'll get into the organizational portion of the meeting. We've got a few things to